On September 7th, 1940, Hermann Göring stood on the French coast at Cap Blanc-Neige, binoculars in hand, watching wave after wave of Luftwaffe bombers cross the English Channel. A smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. Why? Because his intelligence officers had just handed him reports that would make any military commander feel victorious. RAF Fighter Command, they said, was finished. It was over. According to Luftwaffe intelligence assessments, the British had only around 100 operational fighters left, maybe even fewer. The math seemed simple. Germany had been relentlessly attacking RAF airfields since August 13th, in what was known as Adler Tag, Eagle Day. Stations like Kenley, Biggin Hill, Manston and Hornchurch had been pummeled into submission. These weren't just places on a map. They were smoking ruins. Hangars had collapsed like flimsy boxes, and runways were cratered beyond recognition. Major Joseph Bayo Schmid, the Luftwaffe's chief of intelligence, had meticulously assessed the damage. On paper, it looked catastrophic. Over a dozen RAF stations had been repeatedly bombed. On August 15th alone, the Luftwaffe had launched more than 1,500 sorties, the largest single-day aerial battle in history up until that point. German pilots returned with gun camera footage, showing direct hits. They witnessed the explosions, saw the burning Hurricanes and Spitfires on the ground. The reports flooding into Luftwaffe headquarters painted a picture of an air force on its deathbed, bleeding out on its own airfields. But here's where history took an unexpected turn. Each morning after these devastating raids, as German bomber formations crossed into British airspace, they were met by squadrons of Spitfires and Hurricanes. Not a few stragglers, but full squadrons, 12 aircraft here, 16 there, rising from what should have been destroyed airfields. On August 30th alone, RAF fighters flew over 1,000 sorties. This was from an air force that supposedly had fewer operational aircraft than sorties flown. The numbers didn't just fail to add up. They were impossible. Göring was furious. He accused his pilots of exaggerating kills. He questioned his intelligence officers. Could the British possibly be rebuilding fighters overnight? Were they flying damaged aircraft, held together with tape and hope? The Reichsmarschall couldn't fathom it. His bombers had photographed destroyed hangars. His fighters had strafed grounded aircraft. The craters were real. The fires were real. The destruction had been documented. Yet every day the RAF kept coming, fighting back, appearing exactly where German intelligence said they shouldn't exist anymore. What Göring didn't know, and what his entire intelligence apparatus had completely overlooked, was that the airfields he was seeing, the ones marked on every map, the major stations with their permanent buildings and runways, were only part of the picture. The British had created an invisible air force, operating from fields that the Germans had never photographed because they didn't even know to look for them. These airfields didn't appear on any pre-war maps or in any intelligence files. They were ghost bases, satellite airfields so cleverly concealed that even when German reconnaissance aircraft flew directly over them, they appeared as nothing more than ordinary farmland. This wasn't luck, nor was it improvised. It was strategic deception, executed so effectively that the Luftwaffe couldn't even comprehend it. The concept was deceptively simple. For every major RAF station on German maps, Britain had built 3, 4, or sometimes 5 additional landing strips scattered within a 10-mile radius. These weren't full airfields in the traditional sense. They were emergency landing strips, refueling points, and dispersal areas. Operational bases that could function as lifelines when the parent station came under attack. The official term was satellite airfields, but they were far less formal than that. Many of these sites were simply farmers' fields that had been surveyed, flattened, and repurposed for fighter operations. The Air Ministry had begun developing this network as early as 1938, anticipating the coming conflict. They understood something fundamental about aerial warfare that the Germans seemingly didn't. Concentration makes you vulnerable. If you park 50 Spitfires on one airfield, a single bombing raid can wipe out your entire squadron in minutes. But if those same 50 aircraft are spread across 5 different locations, hidden in woodlands and behind hedgerows, the enemy has to find and destroy all 5 sites to achieve the same result. Finding them, however, was no easy task. By the summer of 1940, RAF Fighter Command had over 70 of these satellite fields operational across southern England. Some were relatively elaborate, with proper runways, like RAF West Hampnet near Chichester, which served as a satellite for Tangmere. Others were little more than grass strips with a few tents and fuel bowsers camouflaged under netting, and every single one of them was invisible to German reconnaissance. The Luftwaffe's pre-war intelligence had mapped Britain's airfields in great detail. They knew where Biggin Hill, Kenley, Northolt and other major stations were. What they didn't know was that these obvious targets had become decoys. The Germans could bomb them into oblivion, but the squadrons would simply operate from the satellite airfields the next morning. Take RAF Northolt in Middlesex. The Germans had repeatedly hammered it in late August. Photographs showed cratered runways and damaged buildings, but the next day, British fighters were back in the air. The German intelligence reports that Göring had received told a story of devastation. But the British had devised a strategy of invisibility, one that not only kept the RAF fighting, but also taught the Luftwaffe a lesson in deception they would never forget. Except for the Northolt squadrons, including the famous Polish 303 Squadron. Most were already operating primarily from Hon, a satellite field just a few miles south. The Polish pilots didn't even stay at Northolt. They were billeted in requisitioned houses near Hon, where their hurricanes were dispersed under trees, camouflaged with nets that made them blend seamlessly with the surrounding woodland. In Kent, RAF Hawkinger sat dramatically on the cliffs near Folkestone, seemingly destroyed after repeated Stuka attacks in August. The operations room had been obliterated. The hangars were skeletal remains of twisted metal, and the main runway was rendered unusable. Yet 32 Squadron continued flying daily patrols throughout September. How? They had relocated to Limpne and Dettling, satellite fields inland that the Luftwaffe barely touched, because they were unaware that these grass strips were now fully operational fighter bases. The network stretched from Portsmouth to Colchester, from the Thames estuary to the Sussex Downs. Fighter Command had effectively created a decentralized, resilient air defense system where bombing the visible infrastructure meant almost nothing. The Germans were playing checkers, attacking the pieces they could see, while the British were playing three-dimensional chess with most of their assets hidden beneath the board. Creating an invisible airfield required far more than just parking planes under trees. The engineering challenge was immense. A flat strip of land at least 800 yards long was needed for a Spitfire to land safely. Fuel storage, thousands of gallons of high-octane aviation fuel, ammunition dumps, maintenance equipment, and accommodations for pilots and ground crews were all necessary. These facilities had to be functional enough to launch combat operations within minutes, but concealed so effectively that a German reconnaissance Dornier, flying at 20,000 feet, would see nothing but countryside. The RAF's approach was part engineering, part theater. Take the runway itself. Most satellite fields used grass strips instead of concrete or tarmac. Why? Because grass looked like every other field in England from the air. Groundskeepers would mow patterns into the grass that mimicked agricultural land, alternating strips of slightly different heights, which, from above, looked like a farmer had been ploughing. Some fields even kept actual sheep or cattle grazing on the landing strips right up until aircraft needed to use them. When that time came, a crew member would herd the animals off, planes would take off or land, and the livestock would return within an hour. German photo interpreters, reviewing these images, saw farmland, not military infrastructure. Fuel storage was another masterstroke of deception. At several sites in Sussex and Kent, the RAF built fake barns and grain silos that were actually reinforced fuel tanks. The wooden exteriors looked old and authentic. Some were even adorned with old farm equipment leaning against them. Inside, steel tanks held 5,000 gallons of 100-octane fuel, connected by underground pipes to dispersed refueling points. At RAF West Hampnet, fuel bowsers were disguised as farm trailers, parked in hedgerows. Pilots would taxi their Spitfires behind a line of trees, and ground crews, dressed in civilian work clothes, would refuel the planes from what appeared to be agricultural equipment. Hangars presented the trickiest challenge. A 100-foot metal building can't easily be hidden, so the British used collapsible structures known as bellman hangars, large tents with steel frames that could be erected and dismantled in just a few hours. When not in use, these hangars were completely dismantled and hidden in nearby barns or woodlands. Even when assembled, they were covered in camouflage netting with real foliage woven into it. From 200 feet up, they appeared to be dense tree cover. The most elaborate deceptions involved fake buildings on actual damaged airfields. After Manston in Kent was heavily bombed in late August, RAF engineers constructed replica destroyed hangars, structures that looked bombed out from the air but were intact underneath corrugated camouflage covers. Meanwhile, the real operational hangars were used for maintenance, hidden under netting that made them appear as rubble piles. German reconnaissance photographed the damage, filed their reports, and assumed the airfield was out of commission. In reality, Manston remained fully operational throughout the period. At RAF Roford in Essex, the entire dispersal area was camouflaged to resemble a residential neighborhood. Aircraft revetments were designed to look like suburban houses, complete with fake chimneys and garden hedges. Pilots taxied between these mock houses, which were actually reinforced blast pens. One German pilot, shot down and captured near Roford, later reported that he had flown over the area multiple times and never suspected it was an active fighter station. He thought he was navigating a suburban development, RAF Tangmere, located 3 miles east of Chichester in West Sussex, was one of the most important fighter stations in 11 Group in August 1940, crucial for defending London and the southeast. On August 16th, the Luftwaffe attacked it with everything they had. Junkers 87 Stukas screamed down in near-vertical dives, dropping 500 LB bombs directly onto the station. The attack lasted for 12 minutes. When the smoke cleared, 14 people were dead, the operations block was destroyed, the hangars were burning, and the main runway was torn apart. Luftwaffe reconnaissance photographed the damage. That afternoon, intelligence officers filed their reports, and Tangmere was officially marked as destroyed. Yet beneath the rubble, the station remained operational, except for the Northolt squadrons, including the famed Polish 303 Squadron. Most were already primarily operating from Hon, a satellite field located just a few miles south. The Polish pilots didn't even stay at Northolt. They were billeted in requisitioned houses near Hon, while their Hurricanes were camouflaged under trees, concealed with nets that made them blend seamlessly with the surrounding woodland. In Kent, RAF Hawkinger sat dramatically on the cliffs near Folkestone, seemingly destroyed after multiple Stuka attacks in August. The operations room had been wiped out, the hangars were reduced to twisted metal, and the main runway was rendered unusable. However, 32 Squadron continued to fly daily patrols throughout September. How? They had moved to Limpne and Dettling, satellite fields inland that the Luftwaffe had barely touched, because they were unaware that these grass strips had become fully operational fighter bases. The network stretched from Portsmouth to Colchester, and from the Thames estuary to the Sussex Downs. Fighter Command had effectively created a decentralized, resilient air defense system, where bombing the visible infrastructure meant almost nothing. The Germans were playing checkers, attacking only the pieces they could see, while the British were playing three-dimensional chess with most of their assets hidden beneath the surface. Creating an invisible airfield wasn't a simple task. The engineering involved was monumental. A flat strip of land at least 800 yards long was necessary for a Spitfire to land safely. Fuel storage, thousands of gallons of high-octane aviation fuel, ammunition dumps, maintenance equipment, and accommodations for pilots and ground crews all had to be present. These facilities needed to be functional enough to launch combat operations in minutes. yet hidden so effectively that German reconnaissance Dornier aircraft, flying at 20,000 feet, would see nothing but countryside. The RAF's approach was both engineering and theatrical. Take the runway itself. Most satellite fields used grass strips instead of concrete or tarmac. Why? Because grass looked like any other field in England from the air. Groundskeepers would mow patterns into the grass to mimic agricultural land, alternating strips of slightly different heights, which from above appeared as though a farmer had been ploughing. Some fields even kept sheep or cattle grazing on the landing strips until aircraft needed to use them. Once the time came, a crew member would herd the animals off, the planes would land, and the livestock would return within the hour. German photo interpreters reviewing these images saw farmland, not military infrastructure. Fuel storage was hidden in plain sight through ingenious deception. At several sites in Sussex and Kent, the RAF built fake barns and grain silos that were actually reinforced fuel tanks. The wooden exteriors appeared aged and authentic, with old farm equipment propped against them. Inside, steel tanks held 5,000 gallons of 100-octane fuel, connected by underground pipes to dispersed refueling points. At RAF West Hampnet, fuel bowsers were disguised as farm trailers, parked in hedgerows. Pilots would taxi their Spitfires behind a line of trees, and ground crews, dressed in civilian clothes, would refuel the planes from what looked like agricultural equipment. Hangars were the most difficult problem. A 100-foot metal building couldn't be hidden easily. So the British used collapsible Bellman hangars, large tents with steel frames that could be set up and dismantled in a few hours. When not in use, the hangars were completely taken down and stored in nearby barns or woodlands. Even when erected, they were covered with camouflage netting adorned with real foliage. From 200 feet up, they looked like dense tree cover. The most elaborate deceptions involved fake buildings constructed on actual damaged airfields. After Manston in Kent was heavily bombed in late August, RAF engineers built replica destroyed hangars, structures that appeared bombed out from the air but were intact underneath corrugated camouflage covers. Meanwhile, the real operational hangars were used for maintenance, hidden under netting that made them look like rubble piles. German reconnaissance photographed the damage and assumed the airfield was out of commission. In reality, Manston remained operational throughout the battle. At RAF Roford in Essex, the entire dispersal area was camouflaged to resemble a residential neighbourhood. Aircraft revetments were made to look like suburban houses, complete with fake chimneys and garden hedges. Pilots taxied between these mock houses, which were in fact reinforced blast pens. One German pilot captured near Roford later reported that he had flown over the area multiple times and never suspected it was an active fighter station. He thought he was navigating a suburban neighbourhood, RAF Tangmere, located 3 miles east of Chichester in West Sussex, was one of the most important fighter stations in 11 Group, crucial for defending London and the southeast. On August 16th, the Luftwaffe hit it with everything they had. Junkers 87 Stukas dived vertically, dropping 500 LB bombs directly onto the station. The attack lasted for 12 minutes. When the smoke cleared, 14 people were dead. The operations block was destroyed, the hangars were burning, and the main runway was in ruins. Luftwaffe reconnaissance photographed the damage. That afternoon, intelligence officers filed their reports, and Tangmere was marked as destroyed. Yet beneath the rubble, the station remained operational. The agent network was even less effective. Germany had only a small number of spies operating in Britain by 1940, but MI5 had identified and neutralized most of them through the double-cross system. The agents feeding information back to Germany were largely providing details that British intelligence wanted the Germans to hear. None of these agents were placed near RAF stations. Doing so would have been too obvious, and none reported on the satellite airfield network. Identifying hidden grass strips required specialized aviation knowledge that the agents lacked. Signals intelligence intercepted large amounts of RAF radio traffic, but it only revealed squadron call signs and operational patterns, not the physical locations of the aircraft. The British were disciplined about radio communication. Pilots didn't broadcast when taking off from secret fields near Chichester, instead using coded call signs and references. German intelligence could track squadron activity and estimate sortie rates, but they couldn't pinpoint where the aircraft were based. Most critically, the Germans suffered from confirmation bias when their bombers destroyed Tangmere. The photographs clearly showed the damage, and intelligence reports marked it as heavily damaged with limited operations. However, when squadrons from Tangmere kept appearing in combat, the Germans assumed these were remnants operating from the damaged base, not squadrons flying from 5 undiscovered satellite fields nearby. September 15, 1940, now known as Battle of Britain Day, marked a turning point. That morning, Luftwaffe aircrews attended briefings where intelligence officers informed them that the RAF was down to its last few dozen operational fighters. Major Schmid's latest estimate put RAF Fighter Command at perhaps only 50 serviceable aircraft in the entire southeast. The math seemed solid. Since Eagle Day on August 13th, German pilots had claimed over 900 RAF fighters destroyed. British production couldn't possibly replace losses at that rate. Churchill's Air Force was on the brink of collapse. The first major raid crossed the English coast around 11:30 a.m. with over 100 Dornier bombers escorted by more than 300 fighters heading for London. German bomber crews expected light resistance, maybe a few desperate Spitfires making token interceptions before being overwhelmed. Instead, they were met by a solid wall of RAF fighters. Squadron after squadron rose to meet them. Hurricanes from 501 Squadron intercepted over Canterbury. Spitfires from 72 Squadron attacked over Maidstone, then 92 Squadron, then 603 Squadron, and more kept coming. German formation leaders radioed back in confusion, asking where all these fighters were coming from. The Luftwaffe launched an even larger raid later that day. More than 150 bombers with over 300 fighters. The largest single formation yet sent against Britain. This time, the German air crews were certain they'd face minimal opposition. Surely the British had thrown everything they had at the morning raid. The opposite happened. RAF fighters appeared in even greater numbers. By the time the formation reached London, it was being attacked from multiple directions simultaneously. Pilots from 303 Squadron, the Polish pilots at Northolt, sliced through the bomber stream. Douglas of 242 Squadron attacked from above. 609 Squadron came in from the flanks. The total RAF sorties that day exceeded 300. Not 300 total aircraft, but 300 sorties, meaning many aircraft flew multiple missions. For an air force that supposedly had only 50 operational fighters, this was impossible. German pilots knew the math didn't work. Some bomber crews later reported seeing what they thought were the same Spitfires attacking them multiple times during a single mission. This was exactly what was happening. Fighters would land at satellite fields, refuel in 10 minutes, and be back in the air to intercept the same bomber formation on its return journey. Here's how it worked that day. Biggin Hill officially had 2 squadrons, 92 and 72 Squadron. However, pilots running low on fuel or ammunition didn't return to Biggin Hill with its damaged infrastructure. Instead, they landed at Gravesend, a satellite field just 6 miles away. Ground crews at Gravesend would refuel and rearm them in minutes, and the pilots would be airborne again. From the German perspective, they had just fought off Spitfires from Biggin Hill, but 15 minutes later, more fresh Spitfires appeared. In reality, the same aircraft were now operating from a different location. This same pattern was repeated across southern England. Tangmere's squadrons used West Hampnet and Merron for rapid turnarounds. Hornchurch squadrons used Rowford and Southend. Kenley's fighters dispersed to Redhill and Cutton. The satellite network turned a desperate defense into something that looked like inexhaustible reserves. By the end of the day, the Luftwaffe had lost 56 aircraft. The RAF lost 29, but more than just the immediate numbers, September 15th shattered German confidence completely. Göring had promised Hitler that the RAF was finished. His intelligence services had confirmed it. Yet German aircrews had faced the heaviest fighter opposition of the entire battle. The satellite airfield system had created the illusion of strength, which was more effective than actual strength because it convinced the Germans they were fighting an enemy that couldn't be defeated, living. And fighting from these ghost bases was far from traditional RAF service. Flight Lieutenant Tom Neal from 200 Squadron later described arriving at one satellite field near Bosham Down and finding absolutely nothing, just a field, a windsock and 2 fuel bowsers hidden under a tree. No officers' mess, no proper facilities, just a highly effective hidden network of airfields. The accommodations were equally improvised. At Goodwood House, Polish pilots from 145 Squadron were billeted in rooms adorned with 18th-century paintings. They slept in 4-poster beds, woke at dawn, and walked across the lawn to where their Hurricanes were concealed in the woods. After flying combat missions over the Channel, they would return for lunch in a dining room with crystal chandeliers. One Polish pilot, Pilot Officer Ludwik Martel, later wrote to his family about the surreal experience of eating breakfast off fine china an hour after shooting down a Messerschmitt. However, not all accommodations were as luxurious. At Marin, pilots slept in bell tents in a field with no running water, electricity, or heating. They washed in a nearby stream and cooked over a camping stove. But despite the lack of comfort, they were operational. And that was all that mattered. The satellite system transformed the RAF into a force that resembled a guerrilla army, mobile, adaptable, and impossible to pin down. Ground crews became experts in camouflage and concealment, while pilots learned to navigate using landmarks instead of maps, since their actual bases were often not on any maps. The satellite airfield network didn't just help Britain survive the Battle of Britain. It radically altered Hitler's strategic plans. On September 17, 1940, just 2 days after the disastrous raids of the 15th, Hitler issued a directive to postpone Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. The official reason given was poor weather conditions, but private conversations revealed a different truth. Hitler had been assured of air superiority over southern England before launching an invasion. Göring had guaranteed that the RAF would be destroyed by mid-September. Yet German bomber crews were reporting more fighter opposition than they had encountered in August. The math for an invasion required complete air dominance. German planners calculated that they needed at least a 4.1 superiority in fighters to protect the invasion fleet crossing the Channel. By late September, German intelligence was still claiming that the RAF was nearly finished, but operational reality told a different story. Every reconnaissance mission encountered fighter interception, and every bomber raid was met with squadrons that were thought to have been destroyed. The gap between intelligence reports and actual combat experience became too wide to ignore. Hitler's postponement on September 17th soon became permanent by October. The satellite airfield system had created a strategic deception far more effective than any deliberate disinformation campaign. The British didn't deceive the Germans with false intelligence. They simply made their true capabilities invisible. The result was that the invasion force couldn't risk crossing the Channel, as they couldn't guarantee the air cover needed for survival. The legacy of Britain's invisible airfields extended well beyond 1940, the dispersal doctrine proved so effective that it became standard practice for air forces worldwide. During the Cold War, NATO developed systems of dispersed operating bases where fighters could spread across multiple locations during crises. The Soviet Union constructed hundreds of auxiliary airfields across Eastern Europe to survive NATO's first strike. Sweden's famous BAS-90 system, where Gripen fighters operate from reinforced highway strips, is a direct descendant of the RAF Tangmir satellites. Modern air warfare reflects these lessons, with the U.S. Air Force's agile combat employment doctrine spreading forces across austere locations rather than concentrating at large bases. This doctrine is essentially a 21st-century adaptation of the 1940 satellite system, the Pentagon. studied RAF fighter commands, dispersal operations extensively when developing strategies for operating in contested environments, where large permanent bases become vulnerabilities. The engineers, pilots, and ground crews who made this system work were mostly ordinary people doing extraordinary things under pressure. They turned a desperate situation, German bombers, destroying their bases, into a strategic advantage by embracing invisibility and mobility. The Luftwaffe kept searching for the RAF on obvious airfields with permanent infrastructure, while the real fighting force was scattered across fields that looked like nothing more than typical English countryside. That is the true story of why Britain survived in 1940. Not just courage and Spitfires, though those were crucial, but also the unglamorous work of building fake barns over fuel tanks, parking fighters behind hedgerows, and operating an entire air force from fields that officially didn't exist. The Germans thought they were destroying the RAF. In reality, they were just bombing empty buildings, while the real war was being fought from airfields they never even knew existed.